We don't want them here.
What? They're your brothers.
They're not our
and
brothers.
sisters.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and if you're new here, welcome. My name is Yona, and I'm going to talk about this superiority complex many Africans have towards so-called Black Americans. And look, listen, before y'all come with this divide and conquer stuff, obviously when people act a certain way towards a certain group of people without them doing anything to upset them, yeah, we're gonna call that out. The division is already there, baby. We're just calling it like we see it, okay? Because oftentimes these situations are often overlooked or undermined, but yet when so-called Black Americans respond to the ignorance, then it's, oh, y'all are hateful, y'all hate yourselves, blah blah blah. And look, even though I identify as Indigenous American, you melanated Indigenous American at that, that does not mean that I'm not aware of the assimilation system I'm in. In this system, I am seen and categorized as Black American, although I have had plenty of people point out my Indigenous American ancestry, although that they even admit to me and even other people that they'd be like, oh, well, you may be seen as Black, but you don't really act Black or you don't really look Black. Yes, I have had people say it to me, and some people will say, oh, well, that's racially passive aggressive, which it is. But to me, it just further proves that people know that I am indigenous, but instead of just saying it for what it is, they rather continue with this paper genocide and with the ways of assimilation. So therefore, I must move accordingly. I must move with the people who think like this in mind, because we live amongst these people every day. People just be like, oh, it's just trolls that say like this. Oh, this trolls, blah, blah, blah. But yet, there are people out there that think like this African man that says so-called Black Americans are not African. Okay? Now, whether you believe Black Americans are African or not is at your discretion, but on this channel, my channel, we talk about genealogy. We talk about paper documentation. So what people have to understand and realize is that you have to do your genealogy to figure out and know who you are. We can sit here and say what the grandma say all day, every day. We can sit here and say, oh, what the teacher said all day, every day. We can sit here and say what these scientists say all day, every day. But why not just do the research for yourself to know the truth for yourself? It just, that would be more common sense to me. And this is why it's super important for even so-called Black Americans to do their research. And I say so-called Black because a lot of different people from different ethnic backgrounds was being labeled and categorized as Black. For example, East Indians. A lot of people don't know that Asians from the Manila Galleon came over and was assimilated into the quote unquote African American and American Indian communities. A lot of people do not know that. But however, there's documentation of it and there's proof of it, and it's also shown in people family ancestry trees and their genealogy documents, etc., etc. So I'm not one of those people that will ignore the evidence. I know there's a lot of people that are in shock when it comes to genealogy and they don't understand how genealogy works, but genealogy is something that has been traced since whoever was the first of your ancestors to start documenting their lives through um, the system or whatever. Okay, it all started with that first ancestor who decided, hey, I'm going to document my life, and then their children or whoever followed suit. But I'm going to go ahead and show the video, and I'm going to come back with further commentary.
We don't want them here.
What? They're your brothers.
They're not our
and
brothers.
sisters.
They're not our brothers.
They are.
If you were born in America and have lived there for 300 years, you're no longer African. Those are Americans. We don't need them.
We don't need
They
them
were
to develop.
taken away, unfortunately, but they are Americans. We will develop by ourselves. Yeah, we have the capacity, we have the will, we have the resolve. We don't need them. No.
I totally agree with you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
So y'all see by that video, y'all can tell that she was just asking the question because she probably has one of those channels where she randomly goes up to people and asks them their opinions about stuff. And this is how he feels about so-called African Americans. Now, obviously, not all Africans feel this way, and it's sad that we even have to say this, but no, not all Africans feel this way because there are Africans that do feel like so-called Black Americans come from them, but however, people overlook the fact that there are tons of Africans who feel this way. They feel like just because Black Americans have been separated from them for so long that they are no longer African. And this is where I have to disconnect with them from here because although, let's say that someone from Africa comes to America, right? That does not make them less African. They are still African. I mean, for crying out loud, we have Africans who are now called Black Americans when they come over here, but at the end of the day, they are still African. That's like saying a cow is no longer a cow because it lives in the forest and not on the farm. It's still a cow genetically, obviously, right? But what I feel like a lot of people fail to understand and realize is that paper genocide plays into a big part onto why people view and identify so-called Black Americans the way that they do. Because starting with the 1500s, right, in the early 1500s, they were sending quote unquote African slaves over to the Caribbean. And for example, Vincent Young in 1764 was sent to St. Vincent to colonize that area. And he says that there were black Caribs and red Caribs living on the island, okay? And Young wanted to prove so bad that the quote unquote Black Caribs were not actually indigenous and that they were free Negroes or Negro colonists or whatever. So, despite that, he did admit it, so called blacks or Negroes were tawny or mixed complexion occasionally because of their American Indian ancestry. And that because their quote unquote African fathers intermarried with American Indian women, they had the names, the DNA, just all those things that come with, having a mother of a different culture, okay? And despite him saying all that, he still wanted to prove that the so called Black Caribs were not indigenous. And it's so funny how pale invaders, right? Because let's just say for what it is, there are invaders, okay? These invaders M's were so eager to do stuff like this, but when it comes to white people intermarrying with indigenous nations, they could still be identified as Indian, though. Although they created the blood quantum to track the whiteness that are in natives today. Because a lot of people don't know that the blood quantum is used to trace whiteness. The United States want to eliminate that obligation to give resources, restitution, and reparations to indigenous Americans. So they're going to find any way to do that. And although we have been calling out how there are plenty of natives who are not actually indigenous but are actually white, okay? We have been calling this out for a long time, but guess what? The government already knew about that. They already had a plan for that. They want to wash their hands with the indigenous people of this land and call it a day. So, like I stated before, the documentation is there. People just ignore it because people could say that, oh, well, they were just mixed ancestry, and that doesn't mean that they are 100% indigenous. But yet, we have natives walking around who ain't 100% indigenous, but still able to be identified as 100% indigenous or indigenous in general. And that to me is insanity. Because if you're going to sit here and reclassify, demean, and degrade someone who has African ancestry or supposed African ancestry. Because remind you, a lot of people were just throwing around that Negro word because they look different from pale Europeans. If you did not have the pale European look, if you did not have similar traits to them, you cannot be categorized as white. And that's why so called Native Americans, their ancestors, many of them were labeled as white. So, circling back to so called Black Americans, whether people want to acknowledge this fact or not, but it has been documented whether someone was an African immigrant or not. There's documentation that people can look into, whether it's the census or whatever else, that can show them if their ancestor was born to African immigrants or not. Okay? So the information is out there. It's just that a lot of so-called Black Americans don't have that documentation because they're not that ancestry to begin with. They're not of African ancestry to begin with. Their ancestor is a victim of paper genocide, and they were forced to comply to paper genocidal terms, because there are plenty of so-called Black Americans who are doing their genealogy and seeing that their ancestors was labeled from Indian to Negro to color to etc. So how is it that it could be, oh, Native Americans were reclassified as white? Because when it came to the first census, there was no extra categories that we have now. It was either a slave, free white, or all other free persons. Mulatto was added in 1850, you guys. So that's not a lot of room for people who come from different racial backgrounds to classify into. So yeah, there were a lot of modern day Native Americans that people say are the stereotypical image of indigenous Americans. They were being classified as white because they either have white ancestry or they have the look of a white person. For clarification purposes, because I already can tell how some of y'all are going to be coming in my comment section, so-called Native Americans were categorized as Indian, and white. Because although that many so-called modern-day Native Americans today have heavy amounts of white European ancestry, pale European ancestry, they can still be identified as Indian and be counted as Indian. But when they couldn't be counted as Indian, they could also be counted as a pale person or white person due to their proximity to whiteness, their white features, European features, or white ancestry, whatever, okay? But they had to be in proximity to whiteness in order to be categorized as white in the first place. So it's no surprise to me that this African person says that so called Black Americans or African Americans are not African, they are American, and that he does not need them to build up Africa. Because, first of all, he's a grown man, okay? Men who are responsible, they're going to make a way for their family, for their children, for their nation, etc. He going to go and get it, okay? But we cannot forget that there are a lot of Africans that do have this superiority complex. And if you haven't been in the inner circle with them for a long time, or in their inner circle period, family wise, they're not going to see you as them. A lot of so called Black Americans hate to hear that, but it is what it is. A lot of Africans just do not F with Black Americans like that. Now, I said a lot, I didn't say all. Okay, so don't be playing no word semanticism, because a lot of people like to play on words to not really deal with the issue at hand, and we're not going to do that here. So, at the end of the day, people need to understand and realize that so called Black Americans are really on their own. If you want to get out of this rabbit hole, you're going to have to climb yourself out and be the savior of yourself. Because a lot of so called Black American people are still looking towards the sky, towards a civil rights figure to lead them to somewhere instead of just leading themselves. And it's hard for a lot of Black Americans to hear that because they want to hear a resolution. They want a solid recipe to success. And they don't understand that success is individual based. You have to do what's best for you. You have to look into what pertains to you and what does not pertain to you. And a lot of Black American people do not take the time to do that. And I find that a lot of so-called Black Americans, they will tell you everybody else's history. They will go to another melanated indigenous American and say that they hate themselves because they don't call themselves African, but yet they don't even know their own family ancestry. They do not know their family history. They never looked at genealogy documents before. They don't know what a census record is. They don't know what a probate record is, but yet they have the nerve to tell everyone else who they are. And yes, I went there. Okay. So success is not individual based. You cannot sit here and wait for people to save you. And you have to do your research and homework to know who you are and who are the people are around you. Because yes, we can learn about the different cultures because we know there are a lot of pretending to be indigenous. Uh, there's a lot of pretending to be melanated indigenous people. And there are a lot of fake Egyptians passing off as the real Egyptians when we know what the real ones look like on the Egyptian walls of the pyramids. So, I mean, it's out there. People just choose to ignore it and they choose to be ignorant because whether people want to acknowledge it or not, they really are attached to the looks of people. And when people do not look a certain way, they feel the need to speak up and say how they feel without educating themselves on who that said person is, where they come from, or understanding and realizing that genealogy plays a part in how history manifests. Because people will always sit here and be like, oh, you look like you to death, right? They will sit there and tell you what you look like all the time, but they can't tell you what your paper genealogy documents look like. They can't tell you what them censored records look like. They can't tell you about any documentation relating to you, but all they can do is base their racial bias off on what you look like. And it's so funny that people can do this to so-called Black Indians or you melanated indigenous Americans, but once we start treating people how they treat us or showing a mirror and showing people how they are acting and how that looks on them, then people want to act upset and be like, oh, my reputation, blah, blah, blah. Because it's never really about treating people with respect. It's never about really truly understanding someone's racial ancestry. It's about getting to know that person well enough to assume what you think that they are. And a lot of people operate in that mindset. And they think that they're not judgmental, but they are. A lot of people are judgmental. And that's why they like to push the whole only God can judge me when they are the ones that are doing the judging. So I mean, I'd rather people just be upfront with me and just tell me, oh, I don't really F with you, than to pretend like they F with me just to get money, resources, and clout off me. Let's not forget that Africans will sit here and say stuff like this, but come over here and be like, oh, my brother, my sister, we got to work together against the system. It's like, no, because you you don't even see us as you. You think you're above us. And quite frankly, that is a lot of Black Americans' fault because they give too much credit and power to Africans. And then when Africans want to take the credit for the things that you melanated indigenous people created, then it's a problem. So yeah, people need to start speaking up for themselves or issues like this are going to continue to arise. So that's all I have to say for now. Thank y'all guys for watching this video. Don't forget to like and share this video. Subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't. Hit the all notifications bell button to get notified when I go live and when I upload a new video. And I'm also coming out with a new website, School of Yona. I am finally launching it. It will be live next week. So be sure to tune in into my community tab for more updates. Again, thanks for watching. I love y'all guys. And until the next time,